Adii, thanks for being on the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Jay.
So I'm really excited to chat because I was reading through your new book and also a lot of your successes in business and just things that you've experienced. And we're just in a lot of alignment with a lot of those things, even though we're in very different parts of the world. You're in Cape Town, South Africa right now. I'm in St. Augustine, Florida. We both have sunny weather right now, but we won't talk about that too much as it relates to the rest of the country or world, who's maybe enduring snow or winter still. But hopefully everybody's got a little spring popping up around the corner. Or I guess you're in the middle of summer though, huh?
Yeah, yep.
So let's talk about, I'm going to flip the script a little bit. So anybody who listens to the podcast on a regular basis knows that one of the last questions that I always ask people is, what does work-life balance mean to you? And how has that changed through different seasons of your life? Since that's kind of the topic, or at least those are areas of topics of your new book, I want to flip the script today and I want to start where I would normally end. So what does work-life balance even mean to you? And how has that changed through different seasons of your life?
Yeah, that's a great question, Jay. And I'll probably start with kind of where I'm at with that today, because I think today I'm probably most clear about what that actually means. And my kind of perspective on work-life balance is that I don't think that kind of it does what it says on the can. I don't think that the outcome, that the people that aspire for work-life balance, I think it's somewhat flawed. Not that it's a bad thing. I don't mean to judge it in that way, but I think it's somewhat flawed. And when I say it's somewhat flawed, I think for me, it's about saying that this idea proposes at least that, work-life balance says work is on one side, life is on the other side, and these things can keep each other in balance. And I don't think that those two things are that separate that they can actually keep each other in balance. In fact, I actually think that work is just part of life. So when I think about work-life balance, I want to kind of both diversify and broaden that definition for me. And I rather think about kind of my whole life portfolio, right? And I think about that like that in the same way that you would think about an investment portfolio, different stocks, different asset classes, right? And you would want to keep those things in balance, right? Whatever your definition of balance is. So if I think about my life portfolio, like those includes all of my entrepreneurial kind of ventures, like feeding my ambition, my drive, that thirst for learning, all those things intrinsic to me. But then it also includes my family, which is my one of my highest values, my home life. It includes my health, right? It includes my running, and then it includes things like, I'm a bit of a wine geek, and I want to be able to kind of geek out about wine, and drink, the wine as well whilst geeking out about it. But all of those things are kind of what I would put in that kind of life portfolio, and that's what I'm trying to keep in balance. And crucially, I'm trying to do that on a daily and weekly basis. I'm not trying to stagger those things as kind of by saying, well, this week or this month is only about work, and then kind of next month I'll do those other things. So I'm trying to kind of create a bigger blend about those things in a kind of more in a present day kind of environment. And I think the biggest change then, I think in the past, like I did try and isolate those things. I did say, short-term, pain, long-term gain, and I sacrificed along the way. And probably I sacrificed on behalf of other people, right? I.e. my family, like being a great example of that. And I didn't do it with their permission necessarily. And I never really paid back kind of those dues or what I kind of took from that. And that's probably the biggest thing that I'm trying to change is, going forth like every single day, like making sure that I make the due investments into all of those parts of my life and not just on the thing that is kind of the shouting that kind of loudest for my attention today.
So you have 2 boys, is that right?
Yeah, they're 6 and 9.
6 and 9. Okay, great. So your kids are a little bit younger than mine. I have 5 kids. Mine range from 8 to 16. So I'm in that like next bracket of age group up. And I'm curious for you, like I assume, and I don't know the dates exactly, but I assume when you started your first business was probably before you had children. And then now obviously you have children. So how has that changed, your thought process and priorities, on a daily or even yearly basis?
Yeah, 2 things that come to mind, Jay, and one of them was probably one of those first epiphanies that I had when Adii Jr. was about 1 year. I think it was maybe wasn't even 1 year old, And it was one of those epiphanies that I should have listened to at the time, and I should have taken kind of more drastic action. But I kind of had the epiphany, and then I kind of naturally went forth, right? But the epiphany was, or the experience was, my wife came up to me and she said, you know, you're managing your son. And I said, what are you talking about? She said, like, well, you're changing his diaper and you're half emailing here on your phone and you're not really present, right? You're managing him like you would manage anyone on the team. And that was very much that mode. So that was in my previous business, with Teams, WooCommerce, and the latter stages thereof that Adii Jr. was born. And I said, like, the reason I mentioned that part of it is just I should have listened at that stage, right? And I didn't. And I think that kind of the biggest influence there probably then, based on that, Jay, is the fact that I've had to learn that kids are highly unpredictable in so many ways, like most of them highly magical, right? And it is absolutely impossible. If I'm not going to be flexible and I'm not going to build my day and week and business in a way that can accommodate them at least sometimes, then it's always going to be these kind of two things that are just going to kind of bash heads, and it's not going to work. And like one of the simpler things that I've done in that regard is, even pre-COVID, I worked exclusively from home, had distributed teams, and when my kids were still in kindergarten, especially my youngest, who is like he likes a little bit of a rough and tumble, right? But he would come home at 12:30, 1 p.m. from kindergarten, and then he'd come into my office, and then like he would knock me off the chair and we'd kind of roll around for 10 minutes on the floor. And it's just that little kind of bit of interplay that I had to make space for on a daily basis. And some days it was like, oh, he's coming at that exact moment where I'm deep into this problem that I'm trying to solve, and it's not ideal in air quotes. But I realized that if I'm not gonna like figure out how to be flexible around those things and compromise on my part, then I'm probably kind of missing out on so many great experiences with my kids, with my family, in other spaces of my life.
Yeah, absolutely. And so thinking about, things that you had to adjust in order to become more flexible, kids do change everything basically. and then you have to decide as a business leader and entrepreneur, like how much time and where that time is going to be invested and what that looks like. And, like you said, you've been distributed for a long time, but for many people, they're now trying to figure out what remote work looks like and how do I work from home while also being present and all these kinds of things. So what kind of things did you have to change or put in place that allowed you to create more flexibility in whatever your role and responsibility was at work so that you could have more flexibility at home?
I think it's two things that immediately pop to mind. There is the one is just my personal ambition, and being able to say what is enough, and what is truly urgent and important today. Because I think like in my younger years, and especially pre-kids, it was easy to just say, what, there's always more. Like the reality is there's always more work to do. Like for entrepreneurs out there, that to-do list like never ends. Like you get through that to-do list, and the reality is we're going to make up another to-do list to follow that one, right? So the only question is how much work and what kind of time frame you should put in. And I've kind of in the past I said it was just this natural motion of I'll just go with hard work and ambition, and I'll just feed that beast, and I'll never question it. So I think that's the first part, is just that awareness and saying, what, a little bit slower, not doing everything, maybe only doing 8 out of 10 things, letting 2 lesser important kind of things drop off the radar. Like that helps, because that immediately creates space. The other part of it, and I only gotten onto this with Conversio, which was kind of my second business, and the biggest change from first to second was really thinking through the team culture and how to build that proactively. Because with WooThemes and WooCommerce, that culture kind of happened to us. And the thing that I had to do there was, in the same way that I needed to find what was enough, like good enough or just enough for me, right? I also needed to create that space for team members to be able to know that, hey, if you have an off day, or hey, if you've got a sick kid at home, just take the day off. Like, don't even ask permission, just notify everyone. Like, that's more important. And I think, before I got onto this idea of life profitability, what my team and I used to say was just this idea of, we are a life and a family first company and team. And it was just that notion that, what, the most purposeful and meaningful things happens outside of work. So whatever we do inside of work should always optimize for that. Neglect the work, but the work should empower those things.
So, what's interesting to me is I think about people that may not know some of the products that you have been involved with. I mean, WooCommerce, which you helped co-found, is one of the top e-commerce platforms in the world. We use it all the time on websites that we build for our clients, and super extensible, tons of things it can do. It's changed a ton over time and become really robust. And then you went on to build some other products, selling a couple of those things. There's a lot going on there. So, I'm curious, what was the kind of focus behind writing this new book? So the new book title, for those who may not know, is called Life Profitability, the new measure of entrepreneurial success. So like, what made you say, you know what, I need to write this book. I have something I need to put out in the world that's not about specifically building a team or creating a product or selling a business, the things that you have been successful at.
Yeah. There's I think the one that's most close to heart, Jay, or the reason most close to heart is I often think about my own mortality and my legacy. And I especially think about that in relation to kind of my boys who are still young and don't have the life experience or vocabulary necessarily for me to fully engage them about all these things that defines me as their dad. And I often I often think about, how do I leave these breadcrumbs for them in my life so that they can, if they wanted to eventually, when they're older or whatever, they can essentially retrace their steps and learn more about their dad. And I think in that sense, I wanted to put this book out there because it is just so close to my heart, both in terms of what I hope to do next, right? But also just in terms of being very open about where I took the wrong steps in the past, and how, what I learned through that and how I'm going about that. The book itself, it's not a fairy tale, right? It's a vulnerable account with some, vulnerable account of my journey, right? And some lessons that I learned there and some ideas that others can take away from that. And I think just in showing, I love the kind of this idea of, instead of trying to show a result or to sell a story, I like the idea of just showing the work. And ultimately, that's what I wanted the book to do, for my boys, first and foremost. As I said, that's the one that's most kind of, close to my heart. But beyond that, I, as part of my own life profitability, I had the opportunity after my last kind of, company got acquired, both in time and just capital resources, to put into this project where I hope to give entrepreneurs some alternative ideas about how to kind of build their businesses and run their lives. And I think I've always believed that if you're in the position to do something good for someone else, or something positive, we don't even have to judge it in the good or bad sense, just positive, I think you should do it. And I think that's beyond my boys and that legacy for me. That's what I was hoping to do with the book.
So it was interesting, as I was just looking through the book, the intro you dedicate to your wife and boys, and you said, who have not only given me so much to live for, but helped me manifest the truest me. What do you mean by that?
Yeah. So I think I mentioned earlier that as part of my life portfolio, my family and then my home life is very important. And the reason why those are important is I think those, at least in my life, and I hope for others listening here, that's the case too, but that's the safest space that I can ever be in. And in that safe space, that's where I can explore, that's where I can discover, that's where I can experiment with parts of myself that I'm not necessarily comfortable with, sharing with a bigger group of people or with people that I'm less familiar with. And in that sense, my family and my home life becomes this launch pad for me to put myself out in the world. which is important, for me. Again, like for me, being able to create things, being able to share those things with the world, like that's part of what makes me Adii. And ultimately, like the truest part of this is, that's my version of trying to answer the question of, what is the meaning of life. And for me, it's just about how do I show up every single day, and I try and figure out, like, what do I need to do on that day to manifest the truest version of myself for that day and going forward. And like part of that obviously is like, I want to evolve, I want to learn new things, I want to be better, I want to make new mistakes, not the same mistakes, all of those things as I go through life. And the undercurrent doing all those things is that I'm refining who I am, right? But crucially refining how I make sure that I manifest that who I am out in the world. Because I think many of us probably feel like, well, I know who I am, but then we show up in so many different spaces in our life or work, and we're not entirely that person. And I get it, right? We have to filter ourselves in some cases because of societal rules or norms or politics, whatever. So I don't mean that as a judgment, but my desire and passion for myself here is to try and show up in all the spaces of my life as the kind of the truest version of me, unfiltered, just kind of raw, heart on my sleeve. This is Adii.
That's awesome. I always say that self-awareness is kind of a superpower. And I think I think this has always been true, but I think now in the age of social media, it's probably more true than ever. The whole like what an entrepreneur or a founder should look like or be or have has just become so messy. And I always say that, like, I think that humans in general struggle with this question, but I think men especially, and I don't mean to be sexist or anything, but I think it's true. I think men especially struggle with this question, which is, am I good enough? Do I have what it takes? And the entrepreneur, I think, is especially cursed with that question because we're constantly seeking, like, what's next? Is there more? This isn't good enough. I did that thing, but now I got to do this thing. And so I think rest is often really hard for a lot of entrepreneurs. So how has that been for you? And have you been able to find ways that you go, hey, this is rest for me, even if it's just exploring an old wine cellar or something?
Yeah. Which would not be rest, right? So if you let me loose in an old wine cellar, I would stay there for ages, and I would probably consume too much of the wine, which means it totally has a knock-on effect to the next day. Jay, I think initially, I think the first time I really started resting was probably when I allowed myself to just play with the kids and just play with them, not for a set amount of time, not because I had to kind of babysit them. My wife always gave me so much crap for using the word babysitting. She said she will always remind me, like, hey, dude, it's just parenting. Like when you do it, it's just parenting.
It's a bad thing to say to your wife that you're babysitting your own kids. It's not good.
So I learned the lesson very quickly, though I can admit I haven't used that word, but I use it in this context, right? Because I think that for me, initially I would play with the kids and I would enjoy it, but there was a purpose to it, which wasn't just play. It was like, well, I have to tide them over. It's going to be another hour and I can put them down for a nap, whatever. So I think that was the first time when I got so consumed by the play, like being present just with them, that my mind switched off. Like, for a moment, I just forgot about either the challenges and the to-dos or kind of this what's next, this feeding this ambition. And I think for me at least, once I experienced that sensation, I started looking for other places, for that to happen. So other places where it has shown up for me is, it can often happen for me when I'm writing. Not every single time, but when I write, even if I just scribble a few things. In the past, I got stuck into poetry, right? I published a small book of poetry, for example. That was a total escape from anything and everything that kind of was daunting or stressful, at least, right? I also do it whilst running, right? Like, and especially when I can really get into that mindfulness and I, really feel one with the universe as my feet kind of slaps the pavement. So that's actually how I found I rest. And then like we've built out, again, like coming back to, playing with the boys, family moments, family weekends away. Like I try and, for example, when we kind of go away for a weekend, try and do it somewhere off grid, right? Where like there's either no kind of, cell phone signal or really bad signal so that I can't get stuff, right? I can't get those pings. So rest in that sense, I think, is almost a distraction, but not a bad distraction, the kind of distraction that puts me into that kind of present moment, do the thing that I should be doing, which is then not, I wouldn't say work, but not ambition, not stress.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a really important distinction of like what is stressful work versus something that you actually find enriching. But that whole idea of like literally finding a place where you don't have a choice, you can't connect to the internet. Like that's the kind of thing I think people need to think about. That's been huge for me. I have had to. I'm such an addict to my email that when I go away with our family and I really want to be present, I still want my phone because I want to use it for photos and stuff like that with the kids and everything else. And it's the best camera that I have. And so I need it for that purpose, but I have to physically disable the email off my phone. I literally go in, delete the email account. I have to go log back in, set it back up. I can't just like instinctively click on mail and refresh my mail just to see if there's something for me to deal with, because once I see it, I can't like just leave it. I have to go deal with it. And that's not a strength, that's a weakness. But I think that what you just said is like finding a place. I used to love going on cruises back in the day because they didn't used to have internet. Now they have internet, which is no good. But I won't get the Wi-Fi package if I go on a cruise. I want to set up my business in a way that it doesn't need, it doesn't need me. This past summer we got to do as a family, even in the middle of the pandemic, a 30-day RV trip around the country, and I didn't work. But I've worked to set up the agency to work without me because 10 years ago, I couldn't have done that. I would have had to have been there. I could barely take a day off, much less a month.
Yeah. And you know what, Jay, I think like, in you describing that, because I think that's amazing, right? Like being able to take a whole month off and having the business run without you, like I think that's another superpower. And I think what people, like many founders, entrepreneurs, business owners don't realize is by doing that, you're making your business more resilient, which probably means like in tougher times, you've built that resilience muscle. Like it's not like it doesn't have a single point of failure, just one person, right? It is more resilient. And again, like that is a muscle. Like resiliency isn't I don't think it's a characteristic. I think it's a muscle. And the more things you do to kind of teach that muscle how to function, like and strengthen the muscle, the more resilient you're going to be. The more things the world can throw at you, and the business should have a higher kind of likelihood of surviving. So I absolutely love doing that. And key there is, I don't think you learn resilience by being reactive, right? By like firstly having been shot at and having to figure out how to dodge bullets. You don't do that by being stressed, right? Then it's just brain on fire and it's just survival mode. That's not resilience. Resilience you can only exercise and strengthen if you do it proactively in a calm way, right? In a purposeful, meaningful, calm way.
I think that's so good. And we've found out, for better or worse, which businesses are resilient over the past year and which are not. Some of which had there's some things that are so far outside of people's control, there's nothing they could have done. Sure. But in many cases, it definitely has been one of those things that's kind of separated the wheat from the chaff in some industries, because you see like which businesses are able to make it through like just horrible storms that are unlike anything we've ever seen. I'd love to transition a little bit and talk about like building a product, building a company, building a team. Those are things you've done a lot of. And I noticed at the beginning of the book, one of the sections that you had was titled "The Road to Hell," and at the end you kind of talk through these successes to some extent, like expanding from Woo themes to WooCommerce, making your first millions. Looking back, you said, and strewn on the side of the road of success, I see things I didn't even know that I'd sacrifice at the time. At the end of the next paragraph, you said, the disappointment in all of this is I was never truly present in the rest of my life. That's hard stuff, and it's really weighty to think about. So how can business owners build a product, create a team around it, care for customers, and not end up in that place? Like, what are the things that you want to say to people that are trying to do those things now?
Yeah. So the way I think about this, Jay, is firstly, I think for everyone out there, if you're not clear about your personal values, right, then like like do something to get clear about it, right? So the thing that really helped me initially start think through this is there's a book called The Values Factor by Dr. John DeMartini, and he has a like you don't have to like solely read the whole book. I didn't read the whole book, but there's a 13 questionnaire that he has in there that helps you to essentially like answer the same question but in 13 different ways, and that starts illuminating what like how you would probably vocalize and communicate your values. So and for context there, like it would literally be like one of the questions would not be like what do you value, it would be look around you in your office, like what does that office look like? Is it neat? Is it kind of or is it a little chaotic? What do you spend money on in the office? Like what things are important? And as soon as you, because our values, we tend to do these things subconsciously, and the trick is to kind of be very kind of explicit about them and be conscious about them. So that's the first part of it. Like be truly clear about your values, because I think the key thing for me there is on this journey, regardless of whether you're starting a business or you're 20 years into an existing business, the next steps you're going to take here on this journey, the only common denominator is going to be you as an individual, right? Everything else can change. The business can change, team can change, product can change, families can change, people get divorced, right? You can move to a different country, new friends, etc. But you're still going to be there. So if you're clear about your values, then you can be in alignment with yourself, right? And when you start there, I think the other things start rippling out. And the second part of that kind of rippling outwards then is that notion of kind of being aware of that life portfolio that you have and starting to define those things. And I think when you're doing that efficiently, or effectively at least, probably a better word, that life portfolio closely resembles your highest values too, right? And the effective part there is important, because I think if you think about energy transfer, things that feel more natural will kind of maintain more energy. It will be like lose less energy like the further it spreads from that core. And I think that's when you then see, if you do that and you do that well, it starts rippling outwards, right? Ripples outwards to your team, to your family, to your close friends, ripples outwards to your customers, suppliers, your greater kind of your community and society. So that is how I think about those things. And as you go about your day then, and you are staying aware about these ripples, about your values, about your life portfolio, I think you're already kind of doing a much better job of being present in what is important in that day, on that moment, compared to what I did for the kind of the biggest part of my journey as an adult, at least.
I think what's so good about that is just the retrospect of, like, I can hear in your story, and I can see in some of the stories you've told in the book, that like you've been through some tough days, that you go like, man, I'm not sure this thing's gonna work. Like was this even a good idea? What have I done? And and along the way, there's so many people involved, some that turn into great friends and others that like, you're like, what the heck happened here? And as I think about that, one of the biggest struggles I think people have is building a team. And it's almost impossible to build. You can't build a successful company without knowing how to build a team. Otherwise, you just have a solo consultancy, So I'd love to talk about that a little bit, because you've obviously had to do that over time, and you've probably had different roles involved with different companies along the way. But as you think about building a team, because for me, and I'll give you context for why I'm asking this, for me, it's not just about my life, right? My job as a CEO is to shepherd or care for my whole team and to create opportunities for them to live lives that they actually want, actually enjoy, create an environment where they go, hey, I actually like working here. What are some tips that you might give to people as they are building teams, or even in the midst of teams, that you've learned, either the easy way or the hard way, of just things that helped you build a team and a culture that actually could be successful?
Yeah. First things first, and I learned this from Jason Cohen, who is now founder and CTO over at WP Engine. And he said about culture, at least, he said, every team has a culture, whether you know it or not. And what he meant to say was, like, culture happens in a team, regardless of whether you do something about it or not. So the key is you have to be proactive about that. And I think when I say culture is effectively the things we do based on the shared values that we've agreed to. And I think making that a conscious effort to talk about that, to keep people accountable based on that, like, that's a key part, right? And especially, I often think that teams that are office-based or co-located, they miss this part, right? Because you can use visual cues like body language, etc., to try and orientate, in relation to others. Whereas when you have remote teams and people only speak to each other when necessary, and you don't have those visual cues, the thing that bind that connective tissue is just culture, right? So I think that's the first part there, is like, be truly purposeful and proactive, and open about what that culture is, and build that over time. And the only way to tell a really good story and make sure that story shows up everywhere is to just constantly drumbeat it. Like, find ways to, like, reference back to values. Like, in big decisions, ask yourself, like, what does it say about that value that we state in our kind of mission statement, for example? So I think that's the first part thereof. The other part of this is, and this might sound controversial, but I think for business owners, at least, is recognize that everyone in your team is not equal. And doesn't matter how collaborative or democratic you want to be, how open, transparent you are internally, how involved you allow people to be, kind of to what extent you allow people to take ownership on projects. Ultimately, if, like, somebody that has 70 or 80% equity in a business, they just have a different consideration than someone that has 1%, right? And you could all be pulling it, towards the same direction, but I think it's disrespectful to people to say, well, we're all part of the same team and we're all equal, when that's not the case. Like, people literally just have different amounts of skin in the game. And I think trying to take that cookie cutter approach to every single person also neglects their individual kind of magic. And crucially to what you said, then, and I'll kind of close the loop there, is I think the best teams figure out how to be a collective and pull full force into the same direction, whilst totally honoring that unique individual magic of every single individual. And the work that you do as a collective should always empower those other things for that individual. And if, like, the closer you get, again, maybe not even alignment or overlap, but again, in that kind of energy transition, like, that's where, like, I think that's how you build exceptional teams, right? Where you exert energy within the team, in the collective, and then that energy gets transferred to individual, and they can take that energy further into the rest of their life. Like, that's what's going to make them, like, truly happy, right? And that's the only thing that I think you as business owner, you as team lead, can actually influence, is how do you help them create energy in this thing that they spend a lot of their time on, and then transfer that to the rest of their life, where they can redistribute it into other things that are, very special and very important to them.
Yeah, it's a super interesting way of thinking about that. Like, part of my job is to, like, kind of pass on that energy for them to then use on that project. I don't think I've ever really thought of it that way. That's an interesting idea. I'd love to, you mentioned it a couple times there, how the differences between if I'm in person with somebody versus dealing with a distributed team. You've done a lot of that since pre-COVID, so it's not new for you. And I think what we've found over the last year is some businesses have no idea how to do these things. It's like they're in baby business school again, trying to figure out how to do remote work, because they don't know what the cost is. And I see people all the time, even on Zoom, trying to replicate what they are doing in person, and it just doesn't translate exactly the same. So maybe this would be kind of a good transition, and then what I'll do is kind of round things out and let you kind of talk a little bit about where people can find you and find your book and all that kind of stuff. But I'd love to kind of hear from you some insights with your experience on distributed work, remote work, whatever you want to call it. What are people missing as it relates to building a successful distributed team in this new world? Because my gut says that we will probably move back to more of a hybrid in many industries, but there's going to be a lot of remote work from here on out. So what's your input there?
I think the biggest difference between the two, right, is that with remote teams, with distributed teams, everything should be explicit, right? Which probably means over communication, like being verbose, because you can't rely on those kind of natural cues that we would otherwise, right? So if you and I were in the same room, like I could feed off of your kind of your body language, your kind of your voice, your tone, your facial expressions, like even when it's not directed at me, right? Or I can just see what you're doing over there, etc. And all of those things are ultimately implicit and based on my observation. Whereas when you're remote and you're in your project management software, or you're in Slack, or you're in email, you don't have any of those things, which means I think the best way for leaders, for example, to communicate there, and what I love to do, is not just communicate a decision, but also like, hey, here's all the things that I considered. Here's where my mind went, like, before I made the decision. And you know what? You guys should know that I had a fight with my wife this morning. So if anything actually sounds off, like I might be off. So like, give me that radical candor back and say, hey, Adii, wait, hold on. Like, you did mention that there was this other thing here that maybe didn't relate to the decision, but maybe it did, right? So, and it might be a poor example, but my point being is, I think that's where you take the kind of those things that would have otherwise been implied, or which would have been communicated in a more natural way. You need to be explicit about it and really make sure that you communicate it. And then to your point, like the office-based model, like you can't just transfer that to a distributed team. Like it is a completely different way of kind of running and managing a team. So if you do that copy paste, and I think that won't work. And for someone starting out, as I said, I think the start there is literally just be more explicit. Like rather over communicate than kind of communicate too little.
Yeah, I think that's so important, and it's interesting because even though we were kind of a hybrid model before all of this stuff, now that there's probably more people remote than there are that come into the office. A few people come to the office, a few don't, but it's mostly remote. Is I see that already. I see the problems already like brewing in some areas where people get frustrated, because I think what happens is it's easy when all you're dealing with is a project management system or Slack or whatever else, or email, to like treat people like they're just resources or to do items, and they're not people. And I had a situation the other day where some stuff was going down in a task that wasn't going well, and this one team was frustrated with the other one. I said, but did you just ask how they were doing? Like, are you okay? Is there anything wrong? I think especially for leaders, like it's so easy to only find the bad things and go gun blazing into a situation like, why didn't you do this? And why didn't you do that? And why didn't you do that? And then they're like, well, because my grandpa died yesterday and I can't think straight. And you're like, yeah. Oh, shoot. Okay. Wow. And I think that's like just such a big, it's so much easier to see those things in person. Because if I'm on like a quick Slack or even a quick Zoom, I might not see that. But if I saw you all day, I would sense that there was something wrong. And I could be like, hey man, what's going on? Are you okay? But if I don't see that and I just assume that you're just knocking out tasks, then there's so much risk there.
Yeah, and I think that's a great observation there, Jay. Is again, like being distributed and remote, like means you don't have that full visual on someone's day, right? So you only see little bits thereof. And I think the other thing that people should remember is like the notion of kind of trolls. It is an internet thing, right? Like people sitting behind a keyboard are always going to be more critical, more negative, like more rude compared to in person. Like even on a Zoom call is much better. Like if you need to confront someone about something in a remote team, rather do it on Zoom, right? Because like that will just tone things down by X percentage just due to the medium, right? That doesn't change any of the content or the feeling. Just it's much harder being addicted to someone in like face to face, right? Yeah. So, yeah.
That's good advice. I always tell people, I'm like, look, if you got something to deal with, it's a problem. You need to pick up the phone. But ideally, like now, get on a Zoom call. In person's is better, but we a lot of times can't do that. Zoom calls a little bit worse than that. Phone calls a little bit worse than that. Slack's a little bit worse than that. And email's worse than that. A text message is probably the worst of all. you
Yeah,
know. And
ex-
so,
ex- exactly right. And I think the one thing I will add here, right, Jay, is like firstly from like I worked with my kind of previous team. I left the kind of acquiring company last year, but through the bulk of 2020 with the pandemic, we were an established team. Many of those team members had been like together for 5 odd years and would always work remotely. And then the last year was even tough on us, right? And I think for anyone out there that got plummeted into this, having to work from home and having never done that, I want to tell those people as well that that is not the average work from home experience. Like it's a very intensified, very inefficient, and an unnatural kind of remote work experience. Like when remote work is done well, um, it it has many benefits to both the team, the company, and the individual. So I just want to acknowledge that part. Like it was hard for me as well. Like suddenly not having, simple thing, not having the kids go to school,
yeah.
and at least knowing that for 4 or 5 6 hours a day, like I'm going to have space to do my most important work. That's a different curveball that I had to kind of manage in the last year that I didn't have to manage in the past. So as I said, like you're this from someone seasoned with remote work. The last year has been tough.
Yeah.
That's not the way it should be.
That's good counsel, and it's good for people to know like the reality of it all. That it's been hard for everybody, even people who are good at remote work. Well, let's land the plane a little bit on the interview. I've just had a great time talking, and I think you have a lot of insights. I'm excited for people to go read your book. Two last things I'd like to ask. Number one, where's the best place for people to find you online or find out more about you? And then the second is any parting advice you want to give people to build a business that lasts?
Yeah. So first one is probably easier. So the best place to find me is I'm adii.me. That's my personal blog. So adii.me, my personal blog. I'm also at Adii on Twitter, where I'm pretty active. And there you can find links to the book as well. The book is on Amazon and most other major retailers, both in paperback and digital format. The second part of the question, I love this. You know what, Jay? I love this idea of seeing business as a bit of a game. And this notion of when you play a board game and you finish a round, then you just reset the board and you play again. And doing that, like as a kid, I could play Monopoly over and over and over again, right? And I never burnt out. I never got tired. I just kept playing. And building a business that lasts means that you need to take care of yourself. You need to be able to say, like, through this failure, whether it's a complete failure of this business and you have to spin up a new business, or you have to make deep cuts and pivots, etc. The key thing again is, can you actually get up and play another round? And I think to do that, like you have to do those other things, which is do things that serve your highest values, do things that build that like full life portfolio, and make sure that you're going to be there for that next round, like if that has to be played. That's probably the way I would think about building a business that lasts for the long term.
That's really good counsel. A lot of entrepreneurs put themselves in places where they're in sometimes harm of themselves. And I think that's probably not a story that's being told enough in some areas. There's a lot of glitz and glamour, but not the reality of the depression that happens behind the scenes, I think, in our communities. And it's important to hear that, like, you have the right, you have the permission to take care of yourselves. But you don't need that from Adii, and you don't need it from me. Like you need that from yourself and for yourself, and that's a really great place to end. Adii, thank you so much for your insight and wisdom and knowledge. I'm a big fan of your work and the companies that you have built over time, and wish you nothing but success with the future, the new book, and everything else you've got going on. Take care of your wife and those little boys. They will build a bigger legacy than any business ever will.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Jay. Thanks so much for a really kind of thoughtful and meaningful conversation. I really enjoyed it. And thanks for the kind words. Definitely wish you and the family, your much bigger family, kind of your similar, kind of rewards for the future.
Thank you so much.
Hey, I hope this video has helped you with some tips and ideas to build a business that lasts. Make sure you subscribe to our channel so that you don't miss out on the next videos that we roll out. And more importantly, for some awesome free resources, head over to our website at buildingabusinessthatlasts.com. You can get a free copy of my book there where I tell you how I have built an agency that's grown year over year for the last 20 years in a row. So go grab that, buildingabusinessthatlasts.com, and make sure to subscribe to our channel. Thanks. We'll see you soon.